Max was never supposed to survive. His body was limp, his fur matted, his eyes barely open. Yet there he was, lying in the back seat of the car, looking out the window one last time. The faint scent of pine and wet grass filled the air as the car cruised down the quiet road, the hum of the engine the only sound in the night. John Matthews, his owner, sat in the driver's seat, his knuckles white from gripping the wheel. His heart was heavy, a mix of grief and guilt that weighed him down like an anchor. He had always been the one to protect Max, but now, the roles had reversed. Max, a loyal golden retriever who had been by his side through every battle, every hardship, was now the one in need of protection. John stole a glance at the dog in the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat. Max was barely breathing, his once bright eyes now dull with exhaustion. The road ahead seemed endless, but John couldn't bring himself to speed up. He needed these last moments with Max, to savor the bond they shared, to let the memories flood in. The time for goodbyes was approaching, and though John's heart screamed for a miracle, he knew deep down that there was no saving Max this time. The vet had done everything he could, but the cancer was too advanced. Max had been his companion for over a decade, and now it was time for him to say goodbye. The tears that John had been holding back finally spilled over, streaking down his face as he glanced once more at the dog he loved so much. The car slowed as it neared the park, the place where Max had taken his first steps as a puppy, where they had spent countless hours playing fetch, and where their bond had deepened with every passing day. John pulled into the parking lot, the tires crunching on the gravel, and parked near the edge of the field. He turned off the engine and sat in silence, his heart aching. Max let out a faint whimper from the back seat, a sound so soft it was barely audible. John opened the car door, the cool air rushing in, and stepped out. He walked to the back of the car, where Max lay, and gently opened the door. Max looked up at him, his tail wagging weakly. It was as if he knew. He was ready. With a trembling hand, John reached down and lifted Max into his arms, cradling him like a child. The dog was light in his arms, fragile, but still there. John carried him across the grass, the weight of the moment sinking in with every step. He could feel Max's heartbeat against his chest, slow and steady, a reminder of the years they had spent together. He knelt down on the soft grass and placed Max gently by his side. Max laid down, his head resting on the ground, his eyes closing once more. For a moment, everything was still. The wind whispered through the trees, the leaves rustling softly. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. And then, just as John feared he would have to say the final words, Max opened his eyes one last time. He lifted his head, his gaze meeting John's, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to pause. Max was still there, still fighting, still holding on. John's heart swelled with love and sorrow, and he whispered, "I'll never forget you, buddy." It was a promise, a vow that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Max's tail wagged faintly, and then, as if satisfied, he let out a deep sigh and closed his eyes for the last time. The final goodbye had come, and it was time for Max to rest. John sat by his side, his hand resting on Max's head, and together, they shared one last moment of peace under the quiet sky. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty field where John had just said his final goodbye to Max. The world seemed to have slowed, as if the universe itself was mourning the loss of such a loyal companion. John sat there, motionless, his heart heavy with grief. He had always known this day would come, but that did nothing to prepare him for the aching emptiness that now consumed him. His fingers were still trembling as they rested on Max's fur, the warmth of the dog's body slowly fading. In those last moments, John had felt like he was holding on to the very essence of life itself, and now, it was slipping away. It was a quiet, peaceful goodbye, the kind that Max deserved after a lifetime of loyalty. But even with the calm, the silence around him felt deafening. The wind rustled through the trees, and the distant chirp of crickets filled the air. Yet, all John could hear was the pounding of his own heart, each beat a painful reminder of what he had lost. For a long while, John just sat there, eyes closed, trying to hold on to the last memory of Max. He didn't want to leave this spot, didn't want to say goodbye, but he knew he had to. As the darkness began to settle, John carefully lifted Max into his arms one last time, cradling him against his chest. With a quiet sigh, He stood up and began walking back to the car, the weight of the moment pressing down on him with every step. He had never felt so alone, but at the same time, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Max had been his constant companion, through thick and thin, never leaving his side. They had shared so many adventures, so many laughs, and so much love. Now, as he carried Max to the car, he realized how much of his own life had been shaped by this dog. Max had taught him about loyalty, about unconditional love, and about the importance of cherishing every moment. When he reached the car, John gently placed Max in the back seat and closed the door. He took a moment to look at the empty field one last time, taking in the quiet beauty of the world around him. It was a peaceful scene, but it felt incomplete without Max by his side. With a heavy heart, John got into the driver's seat and started the car, the engine purring to life. He glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Max's empty seat. The road ahead was long, but John knew he would carry Max with him forever, in his heart, in his memories. As he drove away, the pain of loss was still there, but so was the warmth of the love they had shared. It would take time to heal, but John knew that Max would always be with him, in every step he took, in every moment of his life. The drive back home was a blur for John, the road stretching on endlessly before him. But he couldn't focus on it. His eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror, where the empty seat lay behind him. Max had always been there, his faithful companion, his constant shadow. Now, the car felt too quiet, too empty, as if something essential had been stripped away. As John turned onto the familiar street, he felt the weight of every moment he had spent with Max over the years, the hikes in the mountains, the lazy afternoons by the lake, and the quiet nights when they would curl up together, just enjoying each other's company. The house, when he finally pulled into the driveway, seemed to greet him with its silence. It was a place that had once been filled with laughter and the sound of Max's paws tapping on the floor as he ran to the door. Now, all that remained was an overwhelming stillness. John sat in the car for a moment longer, not ready to face the emptiness inside. It felt as though the walls themselves were mourning Max's absence. He could hear the faint sound of a dog barking in the distance, and for a fleeting second, it felt like Max was still out there, somewhere, waiting for him to come back. But he knew it was just the trick of his mind. Max was gone. With a heavy sigh, John opened the door and stepped out of the car. The cool evening air brushed against his skin, but it didn't offer any relief. He walked slowly up the porch steps, his steps heavy, as if carrying the weight of 1,000 memories. The door creaked as he opened it, and inside, the house felt colder than it ever had before. He walked through the living room, his eyes scanning the space as if expecting to see Max lounging on the couch or waiting by the door. But there was nothing. The house had become a shell of what it once was. He sat down on the couch, running his hand over the fabric where Max had often laid, and the tears began to fall again. He tried to hold them back, but the grief was too much, and he couldn't stop it. For the first time in a long while, John allowed himself to feel the full weight of the loss. Max had been more than just a dog. He had been family. The silence in the house was deafening, but it was also a reminder of the love and joy Max had brought into his life. As the night wore on, John sat there in the dark, his thoughts drifting to all the moments they had shared. He could still hear the soft rustling of Max's fur, feel the warmth of his body beside him, and smell the familiar scent of his coat. It was hard to imagine life without him, but John knew that the love they had shared would never fade. It would stay with him, always, in the quiet moments, in the memories, in the heartbeats that still echoed with Max's presence. The tears slowed, and eventually, John stood up, wiping his face. He knew it was time to begin the long process of healing, but he also knew that it wouldn't happen overnight. The journey would take time, but one thing was certain: Max would always be with him, in every step he took, in every decision he made. Max had left this world, but the love they had would never truly be gone. The days that followed were filled with a strange quietness. John had never realized how much noise Max had brought into his life, not just with his barking or pawing at the door, but with his presence. The simple sound of paws tapping on the floor, the light panting after a long walk, even the small movements of the dog curling up beside him. Those had been the background of John's everyday life for so long that now, without them, everything felt hollow. John found himself walking around the house in a daze, trying to fill the silence, trying to find something to do to distract himself from the emptiness. He tried going back to the park where he had said goodbye to Max, but it only brought back the memory of that last moment, and the pain felt too raw to revisit. Instead, he focused on little things, cleaning the house, organizing the garage, and fixing things around the yard. But none of it seemed to matter. Nothing felt right. The world around him continued to move forward, but John felt like he was standing still, stuck in that moment of loss. One afternoon, a week after Max had passed, John found himself sitting on the porch, watching the sun set. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and the cool breeze brought a sense of calm. It was in moments like these that John realized how much he missed Max's company. The dog had always been there, sitting beside him, enjoying the same view, never needing words to understand the peace of the moment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John's thoughts drifted to the years they had spent together. He remembered the first time he brought Max home, how small and unsure the puppy had been. He remembered the joy on Max's face when they went for their first long walk together, the way Max had run ahead, his tail wagging with excitement. John smiled at the memory, even though it brought a pang of sadness. Those were the moments that had defined his life for so long. But now, with Max gone, it was as if something vital had been taken from him. He let out a deep breath and closed his eyes, letting the stillness of the evening wash over him. It wasn't the same as it had been with Max by his side, but it was peaceful in its own way. The grief would never fully leave him, but maybe that was a part of love, holding on to the memories, cherishing them, and letting them live on in his heart. As the darkness settled in and the stars began to appear in the sky, John stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. The night was quiet, save for the distant chirp of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the trees. He looked around one more time, his eyes falling on the spot where Max used to lie on the porch, and he whispered softly, "I'll always remember you, buddy." It wasn't much, but it felt like a promise, a way to honor the bond they had shared. With that, John walked back inside, the weight of the past still heavy on his shoulders, but the warmth of Max's love still lingering in the quiet corners of the house. It had been 2 months since Max passed away, and while the pain had dulled a little, it was still there, lurking in the background of John's every thought. The house felt emptier than it ever had before, and John found himself missing the smallest things, like the way Max's paws would tap against the floor when he wanted attention, or how the dog would nudge him with his nose if he was sitting still too long. Life had moved on, but John's world felt like it had stopped. He had been working, trying to get back into the rhythm of his daily routine, but every morning when he woke up, it was the same. He was still adjusting, still learning to live in a world without Max by his side. It wasn't easy, but he knew that he had to keep moving forward, no matter how heavy his heart felt. One morning, John woke up early, as he often did, and found himself standing at the window, looking out at the yard where Max used to play. The grass was still green, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over everything. For a brief moment, John allowed himself to imagine Max running around in the yard, his tail wagging, his ears flopping as he chased after a ball. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to remind John of how much love Max had brought into his life. That day, John decided to take a walk, something he hadn't done in a while. He put on his shoes and stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting his face as he walked down the street. He didn't have a specific destination in mind, but as he walked, his thoughts began to settle, and he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in months. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, he could breathe again. As he walked, he passed by a local animal shelter, and something inside him made him stop. He had always loved animals, but after losing Max, he wasn't sure if he was ready for another dog. Still, there was something in the way the dogs inside the shelter looked at him that made him pause. They seemed to be waiting, just as Max had once waited for him. John didn't know why, but he stepped inside. The moment he walked through the door, a little puppy bounded up to him, tail wagging furiously. The puppy's fur was golden and soft, and its eyes were filled with innocence and joy. It reminded him so much of Max when he was just a pup, and for the first time in months, John felt a flicker of something in his heart. The puppy nuzzled against his leg, looking up at him with those big, brown eyes, and John couldn't help but smile. It wasn't the same as Max, but it was something something that reminded him that love, loyalty, and companionship were still possible, even after loss. After a few moments, John knelt down and gently petted the puppy, feeling a warmth spread through him. He didn't need to replace Max, but maybe, just maybe, he could open his heart again. With that thought, John stood up, and the puppy barked happily, as if it understood. He took a deep breath and walked toward the front desk. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. The healing was slow, but John knew that he was ready to begin again, in his own way, in his own time. John stood at the animal shelter, staring down at the little puppy in front of him. It wasn't Max, and it never would be. But something about this small, golden ball of energy tugged at his heart. The puppy wagged its tail and bounded toward him with all the innocence in the world, its paws tapping on the concrete floor. It was a feeling John hadn't experienced in months, a sense of hope, no longer clouded by grief. He crouched down, and the puppy immediately licked his hand, its big brown eyes sparkling with joy. John couldn't help but laugh. It was a sound he hadn't heard from himself in what felt like forever. It was strange how quickly this little creature had found its way into his heart. He had only just met it, but there was something familiar about the way it gazed up at him. Max had looked at him the same way, with that unshakable trust and love. John knew it was too soon to replace Max, but this puppy was reminding him of what he had lost, and what he could still gain. After a few moments, John stood up, still petting the puppy, and he made his way to the front desk. The shelter worker behind the counter smiled at him as he approached. "Looks like someone's found a friend," she said. John smiled back, but it was bittersweet. "I think I have," he replied softly. The worker handed him some paperwork, and as he filled it out, he felt the weight of the decision he was making. He wasn't replacing Max, not by any means, but he was opening his heart again. He was ready to love another dog, to be there for it the way he had been for Max. He was ready for another chapter. He finished the paperwork, paid the adoption fee, and took the puppy home. When they arrived at the house, John carried the puppy inside, and it immediately ran around, sniffing everything with unbridled curiosity. It wasn't like the calm, old Max, but there was a spark in this puppy that brought life back to the house. John placed the puppy down on the floor and watched as it explored, its energy contagious. For the first time in a long while, John felt like he had something to look forward to. It wasn't easy, and it would never replace what he had with Max, but it was a start. The house felt a little warmer, a little less empty. The puppy came back to him, sitting at his feet and looking up with those big eyes, as if asking for his attention. John reached down and scratched behind its ears. The puppy's tail wagged furiously, and John felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't the same, but it was a step forward. The house was full of life again, and for the first time in months, John felt like he could take a deep breath without the weight of grief crushing him. The journey of healing was far from over, but this puppy had given him the first spark of joy he had felt in a long time. As he sat on the couch, the puppy curled up at his feet. John felt a sense of peace begin to settle in. Max would always be in his heart, but now, there was room for this new chapter, for this new little companion. And maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what he needed. Weeks passed since John brought the puppy home, and with each passing day, life slowly began to feel a little more normal. The house, once filled with silence and grief, was now full of energy again. The puppy, whose name John had decided to call Charlie, had a way of filling every room with laughter and love. Charlie had his own quirks, of course. He would chew on shoes, chase after shadows, and constantly run in circles whenever John picked up a ball. At first, John had tried to maintain a routine, to stick to what he had known. He took Charlie for walks every morning, just as he had done with Max, and they explored the nearby parks together. It was different, of course. Charlie was younger, faster, and more excitable. Where Max had been calm and steady, Charlie was a whirlwind of energy, always looking for something new to do. But there was something comforting about it. The simple act of walking side by side with a dog again felt like a return to normalcy. John found himself smiling more, even laughing at Charlie's antics. Sometimes, when they would sit on the porch in the evenings, Charlie would rest his head on John's lap, looking up at him with those big, trusting eyes. It reminded John of the days when Max used to do the same, and he realized that, although it was not the same, it was still something. A bond was beginning to form, one built on trust, companionship, and love. One afternoon, as John and Charlie were walking through the park, Charlie stopped suddenly, his nose twitching. He sniffed the air, then darted off toward a nearby bush, his tail wagging with excitement. John chuckled, watching as Charlie sniffed around with determination. The puppy's curiosity was endless, and John was grateful for it. It was a reminder that life was still full of surprises, still full of little joys. As Charlie continued to explore, John found himself reflecting on the changes in his life. He had come so far since that painful day when he had said goodbye to Max. The grief, though still there, was no longer as overwhelming. Time had passed, and he had learned to live with the memories, to honor them without being consumed by them. The love he had for Max would never fade, but in giving his heart to Charlie, he had found a way to keep moving forward. He knew that Charlie could never replace Max, but that didn't mean he couldn't bring his own light into John's life. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the park. John smiled, watching Charlie trot back toward him, his fur glowing in the fading light. The puppy stopped in front of him, looking up, with those familiar eyes, as if asking for attention. John knelt down, ruffling Charlie's ears, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace. There was still a long road ahead, and he knew there would be moments of sadness and longing. But as he looked at Charlie, he realized that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to love again, about finding joy in the little things, and about accepting that life, even with its pain, could still be beautiful. It had been a few months since Charlie had come into John's life, and each day, the little puppy grew more and more attached to him. The bond between them was growing, and for the first time in a long while, John felt truly connected to the world around him. The grief of losing Max had not disappeared, but it was no longer as heavy as it had been. Charlie's playful energy and loyalty had filled a space that John had thought would always remain empty. One cold morning, John woke up early, as he had done for years. The first thing he noticed was Charlie curled up at the foot of his bed, sleeping soundly, with his head resting on his paws. John smiled softly, remembering how, when he first brought Charlie home, the puppy would jump on his bed in excitement every morning. But now, Charlie had settled into a routine, and so had John. They had found a rhythm together. As the days passed, John found himself taking Charlie on longer walks, exploring new trails, and revisiting places that he and Max had once gone. The parks, the beaches, the forests, each place held memories, but now, they held new experiences as well. Charlie seemed to bring a fresh perspective to everything, and John found himself smiling at the little things. The way Charlie would chase after squirrels, the way he would bark at the wind as if challenging it to a race, and the way he would sit so patiently by John's side when they stopped for a break. One afternoon, John took Charlie to a nearby lake, a place where he and Max had spent countless hours, watching the water ripple gently in the breeze. As they stood by the edge of the water, Charlie splashed around, his little paws making ripples in the lake, and John felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something. It was enough. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the lake, John sat down on a bench, Charlie resting at his feet. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cool breeze on his face. The world felt right, in a way he hadn't known in years. There was still pain, still the echo of loss, but there was also healing. It wasn't just about moving on. It was about learning to live again, to appreciate the moments of joy, however small they might be. Charlie trotted over and laid his head on John's knee, looking up at him with those familiar, trusting eyes. John reached down and scratched behind his ears, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Max would always hold a place in his heart, but Charlie was here now, and that was enough for this moment. He didn't need to replace what he had lost. Instead, he was learning to embrace what he had now, the love and companionship of a new friend, a new chapter in his life. Charlie was more than just a puppy. He was a reminder that life, even after loss, could still be full of love and joy. As the months passed, John's life continued to slowly shift into a new rhythm with Charlie by his side. The grief of losing Max still lingered in his heart, but it was no longer the heavy weight it had once been. Charlie had brought new light into his life, and the house that had felt so empty now echoed with the sounds of paws on the floor and the soft padding of a dog walking behind him. John found himself becoming more present, more connected to the world around him. He still missed Max, but he had begun to realize that healing was not about forgetting. It was about making room for new memories, new experiences, and new bonds. One evening, as the days grew longer and the weather warmer, John decided to take Charlie on a camping trip. It was something he and Max had done often, and although it felt different without his old companion, John knew it was the right time. He packed up the car with camping gear, food, and, of course, Charlie's favorite toys. The drive was peaceful, with the windows down and the fresh air filling the car. Charlie sat in the back, his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind as he took in the sights and smells. When they arrived at the campsite, Charlie immediately bolted out of the car, eager to explore. John smiled, watching the puppy run in circles, his excitement infectious. They set up camp together, Charlie bouncing around and sniffing everything, while John took care of the tent and the fire. As the sun began to set, they sat by the campfire, the warm glow casting long shadows on the ground. Charlie curled up at John's feet, resting his head on John's lap as they both gazed up at the stars. The night was quiet, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the rustle of the trees in the breeze. For the first time in a long while, John felt completely at peace. It wasn't the same as it had been with Max, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He had a new companion, one who had already started to fill the gaps that had once seemed so wide and empty. Charlie may have been different, but he was exactly what John needed. As the fire burned down to embers, John looked down at Charlie, who had fallen asleep with his head still resting on John's lap. He ran his fingers through the puppy's soft fur, a sense of gratitude filling his heart. Life, he realized, was full of unexpected turns, and while he would never forget Max, he was learning to embrace the new moments, the new love, and the new adventures that were ahead. The road to healing was long, but with Charlie by his side, it no longer felt so daunting. John knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. As the seasons began to change, so did John's outlook on life. The harsh winter months had passed, and with the arrival of spring, there was a newfound sense of growth and renewal in his world. Charlie had settled into his life completely, a constant presence by John's side. The once quiet house now echoed with the sounds of excitement, a fresh energy that filled the rooms. John found himself laughing more often, his days no longer filled with the overwhelming sorrow that had once consumed him. Charlie had become more than just a companion. He had become a reminder of the beauty in the little things, of how love could come in many different forms. One bright afternoon, John took Charlie to the park. It was a place he and Max had visited often, a place where they had spent countless afternoons together, walking along the trails and enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. The park had always held a special place in John's heart, but now, with Charlie by his side, it felt different. They walked along the familiar path, and Charlie, full of energy, ran ahead, chasing after every bird and sniffing every corner of the park. John smiled, watching the puppy's excitement, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of contentment. It wasn't just about moving on, it was about embracing the future. Charlie stopped in front of a tree, his nose twitching, and John knelt down beside him, ruffling the puppy's fur. He hadn't expected to find peace again, but here it was, in the form of a young dog, playful and full of life. John realized how much he had changed in the months since Charlie entered his life. The grief he once carried so heavily was still there, tucked away in the corners of his heart, but it no longer defined him. He had learned to live with it, to appreciate the memories of Max while creating new ones with Charlie. As they continued their walk, Charlie ran ahead, disappearing into the distance before quickly returning to John's side. The puppy's joyful energy was infectious, and John couldn't help but laugh at the way Charlie looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes. It was moments like this that reminded John that life, despite its hardships, was still worth living. When they returned home later that day, John sat down on the porch, Charlie settling at his feet, his head resting gently on John's knee. John looked out over the yard, the warm sunlight casting a golden hue over everything. It was a peaceful moment, the kind he had once thought he would never experience again. As Charlie closed his eyes, content, John whispered softly, "Thank you, buddy." It wasn't just gratitude for Charlie being there in that moment, but for everything he had brought into John's life. joy, love, and the ability to heal. Max would always hold a special place in his heart, but Charlie had shown him that there was still room for new beginnings, for new memories, and most importantly, for new love. As the months passed, John and Charlie settled into a life that felt normal, even if it was different from what John had once known. Charlie's energy continued to fill every corner of the house, and while John still missed Max every day, he had come to understand that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant finding a way to move forward, to let the love and memories of the past shape the person he was becoming, but not hold him back. One afternoon, John was sitting in the living room, his legs stretched out on the couch, when Charlie trotted over with a ball in his mouth, dropping it at John's feet and looking up at him with wide, eager eyes. John smiled and picked up the ball, tossing it across the room. Charlie barked in excitement and dashed after it, his tail wagging furiously. As John watched, he realized how much he had grown to love this little dog, how much joy Charlie had brought into his life in such a short amount of time. It wasn't just the playful moments, like the ones they shared now. It was the quiet moments too, the ones where Charlie would curl up next to him, resting his head on John's lap as they sat together in silence. It was the way the dog seemed to understand when John needed comfort, when he just needed a friend to sit with him, no questions asked. Life was not always easy, and John still had days where the weight of grief would press down on him, but those days were becoming fewer and farther between. Charlie had a way of making even the hardest days feel a little lighter. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Charlie stretched out beside John, resting his head on his knee. John absent-mindedly stroked Charlie's fur, feeling a sense of calm that had once seemed so distant. The world around him was quiet. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. For a moment, John allowed himself to just be present, to breathe in the stillness and feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself, but it was a good life, a life that he was learning to embrace. As the sky turned a deeper shade of orange and then purple, John felt a small sense of peace settle over him. He looked down at Charlie, who was still lying at his feet, content and calm. The puppy looked up at him with those trusting eyes, as if telling John that everything was going to be okay. And in that moment, John believed it. He knew that Max's memory would always be with him, but he also knew that Charlie had a place in his heart, and he was grateful for the new chapter they were writing together. Life had a way of bringing unexpected joys, and though John had never expected to find another dog to fill the space Max had left, he was glad that Charlie had come into his life when he did. With the puppy by his side, John knew that the future was full of possibilities, and he was ready to face them, one step at a time. John woke up to a soft knock on his door one Saturday morning. It was the sound he had almost forgotten, the sound of life continuing outside his small world. When he opened the door, he was greeted by his neighbor, Sarah, who had a smile on her face and a familiar look of concern in her eyes. "Hey, John. I was just wondering if you wanted to come over for a cup of coffee. It's been a while since we talked." John paused for a moment, glancing over his shoulder to where Charlie was curled up on the couch, looking at him with those eager eyes. John hadn't realized how much time had passed since he had really talked to anyone. He had become used to the quiet, the solitude that had followed Max's passing, but lately, there had been something in him that longed for connection again. He smiled back at Sarah, feeling a small flicker of warmth. "I'd love that. Let me grab Charlie, and we'll come over." As they walked over to Sarah's house, John noticed how much Charlie had changed since the day he had first brought him home. The puppy was no longer the small, shy dog he had once been. Now, Charlie walked confidently by. John sighed, his tail wagging with excitement. The two of them had become a team, and Charlie had brought so much life back into John's world. They arrived at Sarah's house, where she had already set up a small table with 2 cups of coffee. "I figured we could sit outside. It's a nice day," she said, motioning to the patio. As they sat, Sarah asked John about how he had been adjusting. It had been some time since they had last really talked, and John found himself opening up in a way he hadn't done with anyone else in a while. "It's been tough," he admitted. "I think I'm doing better, but it's still hard. I miss Max every day." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "I can only imagine," she said. "But you don't have to go through it alone. You've got Charlie now, and I can see how much he means to you." John smiled at the mention of Charlie. "He's been a huge help," he said. He's He's not Max, but he's something. He's been a good boy. The conversation turned to lighter topics, and John found himself laughing more than he had in months. Sarah talked about her gardening, and how her roses were finally blooming after a long winter. She asked about John's plans for the summer, and for the first time, he felt a sense of possibility, of excitement for the future. As the afternoon went on, John realized how much he had missed these simple moments, sharing a cup of coffee, enjoying the company of a friend, feeling like things were starting to return to some kind of normal. When he and Charlie returned home that evening, the house seemed warmer, filled with a quiet sense of contentment. Charlie ran ahead, his paws tapping on the floor as he made his way to his favorite spot on the couch. John stood in the doorway for a moment, watching his dog settle in. For the first time in a long while, John felt a true sense of peace. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Charlie, and he had his life, and he was ready to embrace whatever came next. The weeks that followed felt like a new beginning for both John and Charlie. The quiet house, once filled with only the echoes of memory, now felt full of life and energy. Charlie had become a fixture in John's routine, and their bond grew stronger every day. There were moments, however, when John would find himself sitting still, staring out the window or at the floor, his thoughts drifting to Max. It was impossible to forget the golden retriever who had been by his side for so many years. But as the days passed, John realized that it wasn't about replacing Max or trying to forget him. It was about honoring his memory and finding a way to move forward, one step at a time. One evening, John took Charlie on a long walk, the cool breeze of autumn brushing against their faces as they strolled through the neighborhood. The golden leaves crunched beneath their feet as Charlie sniffed around, his curiosity never waning. John smiled, watching the puppy's excitement. It was a quiet moment, but it was enough to remind John of how far he had come. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined being here, walking down the street with another dog. But now, with Charlie by his side, he knew that life was still full of surprises. As they walked, John found himself thinking about all the lessons Max had taught him, about loyalty, about love, and about the power of companionship. Max had been a constant in his life, and even though he was gone, John knew that those lessons would stay with him forever. And now, with Charlie, he had a new companion to share those lessons with. They reached the park where John and Max had spent countless afternoons. Charlie ran ahead, chasing after a squirrel, his tail wagging furiously. John stopped for a moment, watching the puppy play. It wasn't the same as it had been with Max, but it didn't need to be. Charlie was his own dog, with his own personality, his own quirks. He would never replace Max, but he was carving his own place in John's heart. The walk continued, and as the sun began to set, they made their way back home. Charlie trotted beside John, his head held high, proud of his adventure. John looked down at the puppy and smiled, realizing that this, right here, was what life was all about. It wasn't about the past or the future, it was about the moments they shared now. The quiet moments, the joyful moments, and everything in between. As they entered the house, Charlie bounded ahead, eager to settle in for the night. John followed, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a new chapter, one he was writing with Charlie, and for the first time, he felt ready to embrace whatever came next. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with Charlie by his side, John knew he wasn't walking it alone.